It's time to wrap up my year with Jane Austen with my last review, and that is Persuasion. Hello, book friends. It's Alyssa. Welcome back to the channel. Hello if you are new. If you've been following along, I've been reading all of Jane Austen's major works this year, along with Dickon and Docs over on Instagram, and we are wrapping up the final book, which is Persuasion. It's also my favorite Jane Austen. It wasn't always, but as I've gotten older, it has usurped Pride and Prejudice by like the smallest amount as my favorite, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go along. As usual, I'm gonna start out with a little summary, and I'm gonna link the same person I'm always linking down below for their summaries because I just think they're wonderful. Arnella, I think it's Hobler or Hobler, they're just the best summaries, and I do enjoy their reviews as well at the end of their videos on these Austen novels, but I feel like she does such a wonderful job of giving an in-depth summary. So if you feel like mine's not enough, go over there, watch her videos. I'll link it down below. But as always, as I've said before, I am going to spoil things. So if you've never watched an adaptation, if you've never read this book, please stop, read it, watch an adaptation, do something so you know the story, and come back, because I'm going to spoil stuff. I don't want to spoil stuff for you. I want you to experience Jane Austen for the first time without any spoilers. Persuasion is a second chance love story, and we are following the Elliot family who, when the story opens, you find out that Sir Walter Elliot, who is a baronet, is very vain and very snobby and also incredibly bad with money. He has to figure out a way to not go bankrupt. So he has to decide what to do, and his little advisor is telling him his options, and he decides that he's going to rent out his home, and he's going to take up residence in Bath with his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, and eventually to be joined by his middle daughter, Anne, not by his youngest daughter, Mary, who is actually married, the only one that is married to a Charles Musgrove. This house ends up being rented off to an Admiral Croft, who has come up the ranks and has got a lot of money because it's the Napoleonic Wars, and you can make a lot of money in the Navy if you can rise up the ranks. Mrs. Croft has a brother. She's got a couple of brothers, but she's got a brother who knew Anne when she was younger, and that is Captain Wentworth. So by renting this house, Captain Wentworth, who was once Anne Elliot's love, they did not end well, thanks to the persuasive arguments of Anne's closest friend and sort of stand-in mother, because her mother is dead, Lady Russell. She ended up turning down Captain Wentworth's proposal 8 years prior, but having this family come and rent this house brings the potential of meeting Captain Wentworth back into the picture, and that sends Anne into a bit of an emotional tizzy throughout the early parts of this novel. Anne has been spending the last 8 years following Captain Wentworth's career through the Navy lists and the newspapers and everything. So she is not over this man, right? She said no to him, not because she didn't love him, but because she believed that her friend's advice was the correct advice. And he's been making his way up the ranks to now captain in the Navy. Elizabeth and Sir Walter go off to Bath. Anne goes off to see her sister Mary at Uppercross, and she stays with her for a bit. While she is there, Captain Wentworth comes and they meet again, and it is absolutely awkward. He doesn't want to really have anything to do with her. In fact, he is flirting with the two Miss Musgroves, the sister-in-law of Mary. He is determined to marry somebody, and it is not Anne. He makes it quite clear that it's not Anne in the little POV shift that Austen does, which is really interesting in this novel. While they are all at Uppercross, Captain Wentworth goes off to Lyme and comes back. And when he's talking about how wonderful Lyme is, they all decide that they're going to go to Lyme for a vacation. So all of the Musgroves and Anne all pack themselves up and go to Lyme. They are spending time just enjoying the scenery and walking along the jetties, and they're just having a gay old time. They are spending time with Captain Wentworth's friends, particularly Captain Benwick, whose wife died while he was, well, his fiance died while he was at sea. He's a very moody, like Byron boy, right? Like he's only really reading like sad poetry, and like he's depressed because his love died and he just doesn't think he'll ever be happy again. But anywho, while they're in Lyme, there is an interesting moment where a gentleman passes Anne, and he's quite intrigued by her, and you could tell by the looks, and that starts to catch Captain Wentworth's attention, that maybe Anne is still the Anne that he knew and loved. You know, she's still pretty, she's still attractive, she's still worth knowing, even though he's trying really hard to not pay any attention to his old emotions that are coming up. And then later we learned that man that passed them is actually the cousin of Mary and Elizabeth and Anne. Mr. Elliot is also the man who's going to inherit their home and their baronetcy, because there is no son from Sir Walter, a theme that has come up before in an Austen novel. There was an estrangement that occurred when Mr. Elliot had the audacity to not marry Elizabeth and marry an heiress from questionable background instead, because he married for the money and not for class status or anything else. He wanted money. He also insulted the baronetcy and Sir Walter and a bunch of other things. So here is this man who they are estranged from just for a moment, a brief moment. They've met eyes, and they find out later who it is. Just keep that in mind. Meanwhile, they are going about their time in Lyme, and Louisa Musgrove is flirtatious and lively. Everyone thinks that that's who Captain Wentworth is going to propose to, because her sister Henrietta is engaged to somebody else. It's getting windy one day. They're walking on these like jetties in Lyme, and they decide to get off the top bit because it's too windy to walk there, and to return home because it's just too windy to walk out there. And Louisa, being Louisa, wants to hop off the top step into the dashing Captain Wentworth's arms. She does that once, and they're like, oh, that's good. Like, enjoy. Like, let's go. Like, it's really dangerous. And she doesn't listen. And so she runs up the stairs. She's like, I want to do it again. And she does it again, but she does it before Captain Wentworth can get there to catch her, because he wasn't prepared for that. And she ends up falling, hitting her head, and she's unconscious for some time. Everybody basically loses the ability to do anything, and they're all freaking out, except for Anne, who takes charge of this moment and sends people to the surgeon and gets her back to the house, does all this stuff, and Anne really takes charge. And that is really the key pivotal moment when Captain Wentworth remembers Anne, like remembers who she is. He sees her, the Anne I think that he knew in that moment. Eventually it's decided that Mary is going to stay behind. Mary and Charles, who is Louisa's brother, are going to stay behind and take care of Louisa. They're going to stay with Captain Wentworth's friends. The wife of his friend is an old nurse. Captain Benwick is staying with them. He is going to read poetry to her the whole time. And so Henrietta, Anne, and Captain Wentworth spend an awkward ride back to Uppercross to tell the parents, tell Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove what happened to their daughter. We get updates that Louisa is getting better throughout time, and eventually Anne has to leave Uppercross and go to Bath to meet her actual family. She can no longer stay away from them, basically. She's not looking forward to going to Bath. She doesn't want to go to Bath. Bath is not her scene. While she's in Bath, she meets up with her friend, Mrs. Smith, who is a widow living in more impoverished circumstances. She comes from like the same level sort of society and class structure as Anne, but she's fallen down a few rungs because her husband does not do well with money, and She's a woman alone. But also she is thrown into company with Mr. Elliot quite a bit. And we learn that Mr. Elliot is quite taken with Anne. He really does like her. Everyone starts to think that he's going to propose to Anne and that Anne's going to marry him. There's also another person in this story who is very important that I haven't mentioned yet. Before Sir Walter and Elizabeth head off to Bath, they take with them Mrs. Clay, who is the daughter of his financier or whatever, the guy who helps run his whatever. Takes Mrs. Clay, who is no longer married, takes her with them as Elizabeth's companion. So when Anne gets there, it is quite obvious that Sir Walter is at least interested in Mrs. Clay as a human, and there's some concern about how close Mrs. Clay is getting to Sir Walter. It's also important to note that I don't think Sir Walter really understands anything other than his own face in a mirror. So I don't know if he really even noticed the flirting or whatever of Mrs. Clay, but that's just an aside. And it's important to know that Mrs. Clay is there. While she's in Bath, the Musgroves show up. It turns out that Louisa and Captain Benwick have fallen in love. They're getting married, and everyone's in Bath to get whatever you need to get for a wedding. And Captain Wentworth is there. He comes. There's a wonderful moment where he and Anne meet, and it's raining outside, and Anne is taking shelter from the rain, and he offers her an umbrella, and there's beautiful tension, and it's lovely first re-meeting of our lovers. And eventually, while they're in Bath, they start to actually talk to each other again. They haven't really had any good conversation until they get to Bath. Eventually, things start to come out about Mr. Elliot and his real true character. Anne realizes that everyone thinks that she's going to marry Mr. Elliot and she's not really interested. Eventually, she has a conversation in Captain Wentworth's hearing where she's talking about how women love longer than men and how once you love somebody, basically you never stop. He leaves her a secret letter where he pours out his heart to her, and they end up falling in love, getting engaged, all that stuff, rekindling their love. They get engaged. It's all lovely and happy. At the same time, somebody has seen Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay in what looked like a rather intimate sort of moment of discussion, and that leaves Anne a bit intrigued. The story ends with Captain Wentworth and Anne obviously getting married and being happy, but also with Mr. Elliot taking Mrs. Clay off to London, making her his mistress, and in doing so, he gets her away from Sir Walter, which is very important, and he doesn't end up with Elizabeth or Anne, which is also very important. But the most important part of Persuasion is that we get our happily ever ending, and we get Captain Wentworth and Anne back together again and happy forever and ever and ever, because that's how I see it. So that is my attempt at summarizing Persuasion. Summarizing Jane Austen novels is very difficult because there are always so many characters. It's a lot, and they're all incredibly important, and you really can't leave anybody out for any reason. And yeah, so there's your general summary. So let's actually talk about it. Persuasion is often referred to as Austen's most mature novel, and I agree with that. I think what we're seeing here is she's really describing place really beautifully. You really can tell that Jane has been in Bath. Jane has spent time in Lyme. Jane understands the Navy. Jane creates a world here that is much more tactile, and you can really see it more so than in the beginning novels, which are the scenery, the setting, the place is all very loose, and it's much more about dialogue and a story of manners, and it's not as much about description and really getting you into a setting. Jane Austen really spends time talking about Lyme, talking about these places, and you can understand from reading this how much she loved Lyme and the seaside, and how much maybe she didn't love Bath and all sort of the snobbery and vanity and these social obligations and sort of the partying and the parading and around the pump room and all of that. You really understand the world that our characters are living in. You can see that it's something that was very familiar and real to Jane. Jane Austen does some interesting things in this. I mentioned a POV shift. There is a moment where we shift into Wentworth's POV, perhaps. Dr. Octavia Cox talks about this a bit. And it's interesting. We get this sort of moment where the narrator lets us see what Captain Wentworth is thinking when he first sees Anne again. And it's interesting to see her do that. And I'm curious to see if she had written other novels, would we have gotten more shifting perspectives? I would love a novel that does that from her. I think it would be really interesting. And we rarely ever get that sort of omniscient narrator that we get to understand everybody that way. And I really love that aspect of it. And I feel like this ends up being the most romantic of the novels. This isn't so much about making the best match. It's really about people really loving each other. Even Benwick and Louisa, they fall in love with each other. They're not just realizing they're good matches. Anne and Captain Wentworth are rekindling a love, and I love how much more romantic it is. I love Persuasion. I think that it's her best novel, and even if it is a bit short, it's her best novel. Anne can be often described as uninteresting, perhaps is a good word for her. She often sort of blends into the wallpaper in a scene. She can be overlooked. And I think that's a very important piece of Anne, is that she is this painfully introverted person, I feel like. So she does place herself to be forgotten in situations where she doesn't want to be seen. But we also see her take charge and put herself in the picture to make people pay attention to her when she really wants to be somewhere. When she's at the musicals and she wants to talk to Captain Wentworth, she almost makes a scene to be able to talk to him. She puts herself forward to do that. Whereas in other scenes, she's really just trying to be forgotten by everybody there. But she also takes charge when Louisa falls and hits her head. She is also the person that everybody wants to go to and sort of vent and maybe not ask for advice, but she's the person that everybody feels like they can unload to. She's very much a mature character. She's got a head on her shoulders that most of the other characters that are related to her do not have. Mary is flighty and needs to be the center of attention, and she hates to be wrong, but she also doesn't know what she's talking about half the time. Mary is harmless, but silly. She's a little bit of a Mrs. Bennet in some ways. Elizabeth is absolutely vain as all hell, just like her father. They're snobbish, they're vain, they have nothing in common with Anne whatsoever. Anne has none of that in her. Anne is this person, is just much more mature. She's spent a lot of her time with her mother, who sounds like somebody who really kept things in line in the household. And since she passed, her friend Lady Russell does that. Lady Russell does seem to have a head on her shoulders and be quite intelligent and take chargey and ballsy of a woman. She's not always right. She has a lot of confidence, but I don't think what she tells Anne is always the correct thing. It's just sort of said with a lot of confidence. And I think that's how we end up with Anne saying no to Captain Wentworth. But now Anne is 8 years older, and she knows herself better. She knows the world better. She knows life better. She can parse through Lady Russell's advice and see what's something she can use and what she can ignore, which she couldn't have done when she was younger. And I just really like Anne. She is smart and kind and level-headed, and I think she's wonderful. She's a great character. I think she's easy to not understand in the beginning, because she is so introverted and takes such a back seat at times. But when you've read this a few times, when you kind of get to know her as a character, I think she is absolutely wonderful. I think like Anne's the person you want in a crisis. Anne's the person you want as your friend. Anne is a wonderful person. I mentioned that this feels less like a story of manners and is more mature. When we think back to things like Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, it's much more about these everybody moving around in this big plot and all these things going on. It's so much more that comedy of manners, that silliness. And this is a quieter novel. This is a much more a novel about an introvert. It's about somebody that is observing life, but not always connecting with it. I think that could be part of why this becomes the novel that people feel like is the most reflective of Jane Austen herself. Jane is fun and bubbly and can have a good time, but she's also an element of the introvert, the observer, the person who is maybe not being noticed in the background because she wants to notice everything else. But she's also going to, drink a little bit too much at a party and flirt with a man. So instead of being a story about manners and love and marriage and all of that, it is a quieter novel that describes place, that looks at vanity and class and how those things intermix. I just think that it's a shame that we don't have anything after this, because I think that this is such a wonderful point in her career as an author, and the books that would have come after this, what would they have looked like? How much more mature would they be? What kind of stories would we get? How would the narrative shift? Would there be more of this POV shift? Yeah, I'm really disappointed when I think about that this is all we have. These like 6 books and some Juvenilia and Lady Susan is all we have. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about Mr. Elliot. Because what's up with Mr. Elliot? I talked about Mrs. Clay and this estrangement and all this other stuff. The history of Mr. Elliot. He upsets Sir Elliot when he's younger. There's bad blood. He doesn't respect Baroncy. Elizabeth was absolutely infatuated with him. She wanted to marry him. It would secure everything. She could remain like the lady of the house at Kellidge Hall. She'd keep her name. She would keep all the status. She could keep all of the things that she is snobbish and vain about. And Mr. Elliot's a good-looking man, so it's not the worst thing in the world. But Mr. Elliot wants money, and he wants it now. He's in the law, but that's not going to get him money really quickly. He has social status, but he doesn't have any money. And Elizabeth doesn't really have any money either, because her father spends it all like an idiot. So he ends up marrying this woman who... she's related to butchers or some other stuff. Somehow she's an heiress with all this money, but she also comes from a totally different class. So that is absolutely scandalous and just seals the deal in this riff between Sir Walter and Mr. Elliot. And of course, because this is a marriage between 2 different social classes, it's a marriage that's doomed from the beginning. But eventually the wife dies, he becomes a widow, and he realizes that he has money, but what he doesn't have is this title that he was pretty flippant about when he was younger. He's thinking, you know what, actually, I would like that title. So I need to get in good with Sir Walter. And part of getting in good with Sir Walter is that when he realizes that Mrs. Clay exists, that there's this little woman flitting around him who's young, and if she could get her claws into him, she could have an heir. And Mr. Elliot could lose everything. He is determined to keep Mrs. Clay away from Sir Walter in whatever way he can. And then he does meet Anne, and he does genuinely like Anne. I think he's genuinely attracted to Anne. He is very bold at the musicals, saying that, insinuating that she wouldn't have to change her name. I want to marry you, but I'm not going to ask you yet, but I'm going to make it quite a bold statement saying yeah, I'm into you. And that would secure him a wife, which is fine. And obviously Sir Walter would be happy with him marrying her. So you're not going to upset him. But there's still the problem of Mrs. Clay. And I think he always had in the back of his mind that he would have to make Mrs. Clay his mistress in some way. He'd have to get her away from Sir Walter, because the last thing he needs is Sir Walter making an heir. The whole plan hinges on Sir Walter only having girls, no boys. That's it. So he has to get any woman who could make him an heir away from him. But again, I don't think that Sir Walter knows what's going on. I think that he's just this vain man. He only loves himself. I don't think he would notice Mrs. Clay enough to have a relationship with her, let alone marry her. Because I'm assuming that they would have to have a legitimate heir. So even if he made a byblow with her, I don't think that it would work. But I don't think that Austen goes into those details in the narrative. I think Mr. Elliot always intended to have a mistress and to have Mrs. Clay as his mistress. So even though he was really attracted to Anne, and he really did want to marry her for decent reasons, he's still the villain of this narrative, because if Anne had accepted him, he would just still have been instilling Mrs. Clay as his mistress. Those intentions were never going to change, even if he married Anne. I do think it's interesting throughout all of this that he never is attracted to Elizabeth, who is seemingly beautiful and all these other things, but at no point, even when they were younger, was he actually into Elizabeth. And poor Elizabeth is just constantly ignored. Maybe if she was less insufferable, she could have caught somebody, but she doesn't. Anne goes off and marries Captain Wentworth. Mr. Elliot can't do that, so he goes and he takes Mrs. Clay and makes him his mistress. Now his title is safe. He can continue to be the strange, villainous man that he is. But we also learned some things about Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Smith's connection to Mr. Elliot. He is the executor of her husband's will because they were all very close friends. It sounds like Mr. Elliot, though he is quite good with his own money, he put Mrs. Smith and her husband into some circumstances that were not the best financially. He's not doing a great job managing her husband's will. There's stuff that she would like to get her hands on that could make her some income, but he basically kind of ignores her. He's not really doing what she needs him to do. He is really quite villainous, even though he is charming and attractive. He isn't the greatest guy. He's a little bit more like a Willoughby in terms of villainy. He's a good, solid villain, unlike, in Emma with Frank Churchill. I don't feel like Frank Churchill's a great villain. The roles in Emma are very strange, but we're not going back there. There's also some interesting discussions or looking at snobbery and vanity in class throughout this, which you can pick out throughout the novel. I mean, we open with Sir Walter reading from Debrett's, his own page, which it's where the page falls open to. He just sits there and reads about himself all the time. And he's just so proud of his lineage and how wealthy he is and how just prestigious he is and all these things. I mean, imagine he was a duke. And I think this is kind of the perfect transition right now into my year with Edith Wharton, because, Edith Wharton is talking a lot about high society and snobbery and vanity and hypocrisy and the guilt over the tarnished metal that is high society and its rules and wealth and class and aristocracy. And also there's tension in a lot of Edith Wharton novels with this new class of wealthy people, this new money that's coming in. And you can kind of see that a little here in Persuasion with these naval officers that are coming back from war with all these spoils. There was so much shifting of wealth and position at this time, because you could really make a lot of money in the Navy, especially if you rose up in the ranks. You could change your situation in life dramatically. You also put your life on the line, but you could change your life dramatically. So you have these sort of self-made men that are coming back from the Napoleonic Wars, and they are able to rent Kellogg Hall. They are able to set themselves up in society and rub shoulders with people they might not have rubbed shoulders with prior to. It's just very interesting looking at the social dynamics in this novel. I mean, Captain Wentworth is essentially a self-made man. When he originally proposes to Anne, he's not acceptable. He doesn't have the financial stability to take care of Anne, and that's one of the biggest reasons that Lady Russell doesn't want her to marry him. Because what can he do for Anne? Anne deserves more. Anne needs more. How are they going to live? How are they going to do anything? And he goes off to war and he rises through the ranks, and he comes back a wealthy man, and he can take care of Anne. He changes his life circumstances. Compare that to the other two men in this story and their finances. You have Sir Walter, who has all of the title and all of the social status, but no money. And he has to kind of fake it till he makes it to be able to keep up with the people in his sphere, social sphere. You know, they talk about not being able to host a dinner, but they can host like a gathering in Bath because that's cheaper, right? But then also you have Mr. Elliot, who doesn't have money. He doesn't have his title yet, but he marries for money, and that ends up being unseemly because of how he marries for money. He marries beneath his class. There's other things going on in this novel. It's interesting. There's little subtle things, because it's a Jane Austen novel, that are being sort of talked about under the surface of this second chance romance. And I just, every time I read it, you sort of find a little bit more, and I find it very interesting. And like I said, I think this is, funnily, I think this is a very interesting transition into my year with Edith Wharton, which is going to pick up on some of those themes, especially in the beginning with The House of Mirth. I love it. I think this is a fantastic novel. It's the most romantic, in my humble opinion, of all the Jane Austen novels. It is smart. It is subtle. It is quiet. It is beautiful. I absolutely adore it. And I encourage you to read it. If you've never read Persuasion, I really do encourage you to read it. There's some beautiful adaptations, as long as you don't watch the new one that like Netflix did with Dakota Johnson. That one was horrendous. Do not watch that. If you don't think that you can read a Jane Austen novel, like watch the adaptations at least, if you're not going to pick up the books. I think there's a lot of really good ones out there. I really enjoyed this experience of reading all these novels, and I'm really excited to do something similar with Wharton next year. And I hope I am similarly excited when I finish that project next December. I appreciate Dickens and Docs over on Instagram for making this read along. There's another read along that's going on with Canterbury Classics for Jane Austen's 250th birthday, which is happening next year. And I'm sure there will be a lot more things going on going into 2025, because this is a big year, big celebration, milestone for Jane Austen's birth. So I will probably post a couple of things about that throughout the year. If you know of any fun events, please let me know. I wish I could go to like Jane Austen South or something this year, but I don't think I'm going to be getting to the UK. It's not on the docket this year. I got a lot of things happening in my personal life. I don't think I'm going to be able to just drop everything and go to the UK, but it would be nice. We can all just dream about it. I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for watching. Thank you for going on this Jane Austen journey with me. I hope you go on a similar journey yourself one day if you haven't done so already. I do love Jane Austen very, very much. Anyway, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video, whatever it may be, because it's my channel and I can do whatever I want. Bye.